Now with this, let me go ahead and get started. So my name is Michael Chang. I'm director of the National Eye Institute, and I've been in this position for a little bit over 5 years. And it's a real privilege, number one, to lead what I think is an extraordinary group of people at the National Eye Institute here in Bethesda. And we are having this webinar to basically let you know about what we're doing with the National Eye Institute 5-year strategic plan. And I'm going to share my screen here. We have some slides prepared. And really what I want to do is tell you about what we're planning. And also we want to hear from you and a request for information because I view this as a community-based effort. Okay, so with that, let me get started. My plan is that I will talk for about 30 minutes and we'll do questions and answers for the rest of the time. So what is the National Eye Institute? We are basically the branch of the NIH that manages national efforts in vision science. Okay, we direct vision research and we fund vision research. Many of you know that we were basically created by Congress and President Lyndon Johnson in 1968. And our budget this year is $896 million. It's flat compared to last year. And that compares to the overall NIH budget, which is $47 billion. Okay, now I'll come back and allude to that later. Now, I'm really, really proud of what we do and think that it's extremely important. In terms of clinical care, we have supported virtually every major advance in eye care that's occurred over the past several decades. And why is this important? Well, you all know the data that blindness is among those conditions that Americans fear the most. In the bottom right of this slide is a table that came from a JAMA ophthalmology paper in 2016. Showing that in terms of surveys, the survey that was done, blindness was right up there with Alzheimer's disease and cancer in terms of those concerns of people. And we know that disease prevalence rises as people get older. Now, the other thing on this slide is that in terms of impact on science, I'm really proud that at the NEI, we funded the work of 8 Nobel Prize winners. And the point that I want to make from that is that there are many seminal innovations that occurred first in the visual system before getting generalized to other parts of the body or other areas of science, because the eye is such a good target for methodological innovation. Okay, so what we do really matters. When I first came here, we worked on a mission statement. Okay, so it took 6 months to write this bold-faced line that our mission is to eliminate vision loss and improve quality of life through vision research. And those of you who've heard me talk before know that we always come down to this mission statement because I've really been trying to make sure that we have an institute that's very mission focused. Okay, we want to provide leadership to achieve this mission in 4 areas: drive innovative research, foster collaborations, recruit, inspire, and train people to strengthen the vision workforce, and educate people about what we do and why it's important for health and overall quality of life. Okay, so really, really mission focused. Now, almost 5 years ago, we published a 5-year strategic plan. Okay, this was November 2021 that this was released. And I hope that you're familiar with this, that we basically organized it around 7 what we called cross-cutting areas of emphasis: genetics, neuroscience, all the way to population health. And the reason we did this is that basic science programs are organized by, and departments are organized by methodology. And many of you know our NEI portfolio is organized by disease. We've got a retina portfolio, cornea, glaucoma, optic neuropathies. Okay, just like academic divisions organized. You've got a retina division, cornea division, and we thought this graphical representation of these intersecting is the best way to demonstrate that collaborations are fostered at the intersection of methodology and disease. Okay, now when we develop these strategic plans, we do not do it in a vacuum. We start by requesting comments from the community, and we take those comments very seriously. My view of this is that a strategic plan belongs to the entire community. It is our action plan for how the community will work together to achieve that National Eye Institute mission, eliminating the vision loss, improving quality of life, because that's what all of us want. And this strategic plan is going to become increasingly important in how we prioritize our funding decisions. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. But these are the reasons that I'm really glad that we're here, and that you're all engaged in what we're working on here together, because this is really our plan holistically. So now I want to spend the next couple of slides talking about NIH, broadly speaking. Now, Jay Bhattacharya has been the NIH director for about a year now. And Dr. Bhattacharya in August 2025 published what he called a unified strategy for NIH's mission. Now, the NIH mission is up at the top of this slide, to seek fundamental knowledge about the nature and behavior of living systems and the application of that knowledge to enhance health, lengthen life, and reduce illness and disability. Now, in this document, there are 12 bullet points that describe specific NIH-wide priorities. And on the left side, you'll see some of these. AI, training, new approach methodologies that fall squarely within the focus of what we do at the NEI. And you'll notice these bullet points really focus, and this whole mission focuses on the overall health of the person. And the reason that I highlight this is, number one, I think you should know about it, and number two, we're being asked to do more and more in support of the overall NIH mission than in the past. And of course, that's what we've always wanted to do, but that's becoming more and more explicit. And I'm going to try to make those connections later on in my slides. Okay. Now, there was another document that was published by Dr. Bhattacharya in November 2025 called a Unified NIH Funding Strategy. And many of you may have heard about this, and let me just take you through what this is about. So the first bullet point here, the core tenets of the NIH funding priorities should align with NIH and NEI missions, prioritize scientific merit based on peer review, integrate a breadth of topics and approaches relevant to institute priorities, and consider things like investigator stage, promote broad distribution and geographical balance of funding, consider the total amount and type of NIH funding that's already available to each investigator. Okay, so the bottom bullet point here, there are, a year ago, about half of the institutes at the NIH had a published pay line where you could go to the website, and if you're better than this pay line, you're going to be funded. If you're not, you won't be funded. At the NEI, we have never had a pay line, like that's been published. And one of the other things out of this NIH funding strategy is that pay lines are going to go away. So in that sense, that's not going to change, the way because we didn't have it before. But what this does mean is that increasingly we will look at applications in terms of how well they fit within our strategic priorities at the NEI and how they fit within our portfolio to make those decisions. And the reason I want to emphasize this, and I'm glad you're all here, is that there is no secret plan in Bethesda for what we want to do or not do. It is the strategic plan that determines those priorities, and that's why we want community involvement in doing this. Okay. So this is a mock-up of a diagram that has guided a little bit of our thinking so far in terms of what that next 5-year plan will look like. And let me just briefly take you through this. It starts with the NEI mission in the middle, right? Eliminating vision loss and improving quality of life. And there are 4 what we're calling pillars here, and they're fairly obvious. Number 1 is foundational science. That leads to translational science, leads to clinical and population science, and of course feeds back into foundational science. You've all seen cycles like this, and that's all surrounded by this 4th pillar, training and meta-science. Now, the oval on the right side, there's so much that we've been hearing, and you've all been hearing from DC about making America healthy. And there are many ways that we can think about that. One of them is, how we can make America healthy by improving vision health. And that's often where people think of, in terms of, our mission. Another way to think about that is that how can we make America healthy? Because what we do at the National Eye Institute contributes on the bigger picture to their overall health and quality of life, or to scientific methodology. And in my opinion, that's one area where people often don't naturally think about, because we think about the eye. And so those of you who know me know that I've always tried to push that latter line of reasoning. And this diagram really formalizes that a little bit. That on the right side, this oval is, what do we do to contribute to broader biomedical impact in terms of quality of life or science? Now, for example, the work that we do can have impact on systemic health, dementia, diabetes, quality of life, and a million other things. Number two, the science that we do can be methodologically innovative and generalized to other fields. I'll give a lot of examples of that later. And of course, many times we'll take advances from other fields and apply them into the eye. Okay, so think about this diagram and these four pillars in terms of that request for information. Now, what are we looking for in a request for information? The background here is that investigator-initiated research, R01s, R21s, are the key mechanism for achieving the NEI mission. It's always going to be that way, and this is going to continue to be a vast majority of the NEI portfolio. Now, what I'm most interested in from all of you is to help us identify areas that are ideal for targeted initiatives, especially ones that might go beyond the scope of single investigator-initiated programs, and especially ones that may advance the NEI mission in alignment with that NIH unified strategy, those 12 previous bullet points on Dr. Bhattacharya's slide. And I think that some of those 12 bullet points may be more relevant or much more relevant to our portfolio than others, and we know that. And please sort of think about that in the feedback that you give to us. And we're especially seeking feedback on scientific advances that may enable new opportunities in that four-pillar framework, and also feedback on current needs, gaps, opportunities, and emerging areas of research. In research, health, and quality of life that we should consider addressing in those four pillar areas. Okay, so what I want to spend, with that background, I want to go through 5 examples that I think are aligned with some of those broader NIH bullet points in Dr. Bhattacharya's slide. And I hope you'll pay attention as I go through these, because what my aspiration is that some of these examples will stimulate your own thinking and creativity as to what might go into an RFI related to your own expertise. Okay, so example number 1, the eye as a site of methodological innovation. We all know that this is an amazing site because it's transparent, accessible. There are objective endpoints, and there are 2 eyes so that they can serve as an internal control. If you intervene in one of them. Now, the example comes from vision rehabilitation and retinal prosthetics. Okay, there's been some amazing work in the vision field, and these pictures come from work that was done by Daniel Polanker at Stanford and Jose Alain Sahel at University of Pittsburgh. And the example here is that you've got a severely visually impaired patient who wears a pair of glasses that has a camera that captures the visual scene. And that sends data to a pocket computing device that processes that image to extract information. And it sends that data through these near-infrared light pulses where it's picked up by a wireless subretinal implant. Okay, so really, really impressive results with that. But what has always struck me about projects like this is that for this particular project, there were foundational advances in semiconductor physics, wearable electronics, neural engineering, or psychophysics, that there were grad students and junior faculty in engineering or basic sciences, working on in cities like Palo Alto and Los Angeles and Pittsburgh, that were doing the methodological innovation that went into this device. And so when it comes to thinking about an RFI and what we can do as a community, I would love your thoughts about what are other opportunities like this for generalizable innovation methodologically that can benefit not only our field, but eventually other fields. Okay. Example number 2 is AI. Okay, this was one of those bullet points in Dr. Bhattacharya's unified strategy. And that relates to other things, imaging and oculomics. Now, in imaging, there has clearly been enormous methodological innovation. And many of you know that the LASCOR Award was given 2.5 years ago to David Huang, Jim Fujimoto, and Eric Swanson for developing OCT imaging. Revolutionary in terms of clinical care. And from a research perspective, it has been revolutionary. It's given the substrate for things like data science and AI. And I've often cited this, Eric Topol, social media message in 2019, of all the medical specialties, most people think radiology is leading the AI movement, but it's actually ophthalmology so far, because we have so much image data coupled with clinical data, and there aren't many fields that can do that. And the first FDA-approved autonomous AI in any field of medicine was developed for diabetic retinopathy screening by Michael Abramoff at the University of Iowa. And that has led to a whole, what I'd call almost revolution in a field that's now being known as oculomics. Okay, how can we develop develop AI algorithms based on images like this that can diagnose and predict systemic disease? Now, the image on the right here is a screenshot from the American College of Cardiology risk calculator, and this is used, many times, every single hour in every primary care office. Should a patient take statins? What's your risk of cardiac disease? And what goes into this risk calculator that's state of the art 2026 is things like, that are very high level. You have high blood pressure. Do you have high cholesterol? And the image on the bottom right shows that there are several groups around the country now that using retinal images, they can develop AIs to outperform these current risk calculators. And if that's really true, and if these things scale, that is revolutionary in terms of how we think about the eye as a window to the rest of the body. And just in recognition of that, about a year and a half ago, we promoted a common fund initiative throughout NIH. Okay, this is any area of medicine, any area of science that got selected for funding. So it was $14 million over 3 years, together with NIBIB, that we've been leading this. And there were 3 groups that got funded to basically build imaging devices coupled with AI algorithms to do oculomics. And so there was one group from Northwestern, and IU, and one from NYU looking at Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and one from Bascom and Los Angeles looking at cerebral small vessel disease. Okay, so really excited about this. The eye is a window to the rest of the body. Now, I just want to highlight a little bit more work involving building large AI-ready data sets. Now, about four and a half years ago, not too long after I started here, we became involved in taking a leadership role in a project called Bridge to AI. Okay, that's an NIH Common Fund project. So $130 million over 4 years. Okay, now, these Common Fund projects are any area of medicine, any area of science. Okay, so oculomics, that $14 million was a Common Fund project. Bridge to AI is a Common Fund project. And I think that's important for a number of reasons. It's great that these projects represent sort of the highest level, the highest impact of work that's cross-cutting and broadly significant. And the other thing from a practical matter is that these things don't come out of the NEI budget, they come out of the NIH central budget. Things like this $130 million. And, I think the fact that we take a leadership role in these, really illustrates the significance of vision research on the larger scale. But anyway, stage 1 of this project was to generate large flagship data sets that could then be used for knowledge discovery. And we run this project along with 4 other institutes at the NIH. And one of the 4 projects that was selected for this was led by a team of ophthalmologists, Aaron Lee and Cecilia Lee, now at Washington University in St. Louis. What they're doing is recruiting 4,000 people with different stages of type 2 diabetes and collecting every single type of data from them: ocular, systemic, wearable data, survey data, and so that people can use AI to learn about the disease. And one of the particular motivations for this was to understand the process of chronic disease progression, what we call pathogenesis, as well as, so how do you go from health to sickness, as well as how do you go from sickness to health, what's called salutogenesis and health promotion. And, it's a really exciting type, premise. And, of course, there are a million other things that people could use these data for. But the point that I want to make from this is that now these data are being made publicly available for research use. And you can go to this website and download them. And stage 2 of this project recently got approved by the NIH Council of Councils. It's proposed to be $90 million over the next 5 years to advance this. And so as you think about how to answer an RFI, I would love your thoughts about AI research broadly. Okay, where can we make the most impact? As well as how can we incorporate AI into things like early detection, monitoring of disease, or real-world care? And that may require things like EHR integration, regulatory approval, or new reimbursement models. Okay, some of these things may be applied in new scenarios for healthcare that we don't currently do. Example number three is new approach methodologies, or NAMs. Okay, so what is a NAM? NAMs are emerging technologies that can reduce animal testing. And NAMs might include, for example, organoids, cell-based systems, okay, stem cells, digital twins or AI, or other in chemical or in silico approaches that can mimic human tissue. Okay, so the point is that NAMs are human-based models that can ultimately help reduce animal testing. Okay, so why are NAMs important? These have become a priority within NIH, broadly speaking, as well as the FDA. Okay, how can we move toward doing more of these? Now, one of the points that I want to make, and actually, if you are interested in learning more about this, at the last NEI Council, okay, Kapil Bharti, who's our NEI scientific director, gave, I thought, what was a great talk on NAMs. And we'll if somebody can post that, from our organizing group into the chat box, just so you have it, if you're not. But it was Kapil's talk at the most recent NEI Council meeting. But one of the points that I want to make from this slide is that there's been enormous innovation in the vision field in NAMs over the past 10, 20 years. In 2011, there was a Nature paper published by a group from Japan that was the first description of retinal organoids in a dish, basically. Okay, and this was one of the first organoid systems that was published in any field of medicine. In 2017, there was an NIH-wide project called the Regenerative Medicine Innovation Project that focused on stem cells, for medicine. It was $30 million over 4 years, any area of medicine or science. And there were 20 projects that were funded through that, and 5 of them were for eye disease. Okay, and that really illustrates, the impact, that this, field has in the area, that we really box above our weight. Many of you know Marcus Frank, Steve Sang. This is Ian Marmstein, Jeff Stern, and Ali Jalilian. And in 2022, at NEI, we issued a 3D retinal organoid challenge competition. Okay, that was really early for people to be thinking about this. And this was the winners were Val Canto-Soler and Natalia Vergara and Wei Liu. And there's been some amazing work done at the NIH intramural program by Kapil Bharti, where these are RPE replacement, clinical trial, where they've developed methods to take someone's blood, isolate induced pluripotent stem cells, generate RPE cells from it, grow them on biodegradable scaffolds, and then transplant them subretinally. First in human stuff. And some of you know that Ula Yukunis at Harvard has done some amazing work involving autologous limbal stem cell transplants, replacements. People with, for example, corneal burns and vision loss from that. Okay, so really, really impressive, innovative work in the vision field. And as you think about the RFI, I'd appreciate if you could consider what are the opportunities for the vision field to continue to take more of a leadership role in NAMs as these become more of a thing. Now, related to that, I just wanted to highlight some innovations in gene therapy. Many of you know that the first FDA gene therapy for an inherited disease in any field of medicine was for Leber congenital amaurosis. Okay, that was work that was led by Gene Bennett and collaborators, over the past 10 plus years, longer. The first in vivo gene editing, was published, Eric Pierce and collaborators, just a couple years ago in the New England Journal of Medicine. And in 2021, we became involved in a project called the AMP Bespoke Gene Therapy Consortium. This is an $80 million project over 5 years. That's a public-private partnership. Okay, it includes the FDA, CIRM, industry, and 10 institutes at the NIH. And the goal of this is to develop gene therapy platforms and standards for ultra-rare diseases. Okay, and the point that I want to make from this is that of those projects, there were 7 basic biology projects involving vector biology. And one of them was for eye disease, and that's led by Leah Byrne at the University of Pittsburgh. And there were 8 clinical trials that were funded using this, $80 million project total, and 3 of them were for eye diseases. Okay, this is Tomas Alman at Penn, Tony Odave in Los Angeles, and Steve Sang in New York. So again, I think there's been a lot of impact in our field in these areas. and how can we go further and continue to take more of that leadership role. So example number 4, real world data platforms. Okay, this has become a very, very big topic at NIH and in all of government that everybody is talking about. How can we do more of these real world data platforms? And I just wanted to highlight on this slide that there are centralized data platforms and there are federated or distributed real world data platforms. Okay, central is very obvious. Okay, everybody takes their data, sends it to the central hub. Okay, we have a lot of these at the NIH, and in the vision field, the American Academy of Ophthalmology runs the IRIS registry. Okay, really some revolutionary stuff. Okay, Josh Stein at the University of Michigan has started the Source Consortium of EPIC-based sites. And there are many other examples, but the benefit here is that it's very intuitive because you access and analyze data at a single point. Okay, the disadvantages, though, are that this is going to require extensive legal privacy and security arrangements, especially if you're sending health data from site to site. And those data use agreements can take years or longer to broker. And a complementary approach is federated systems where the data stay at each local site, and you analyze at each independent site. You analyze each site independently and then share the results of those analyses. And there are a number of proof of concepts of these federated networks. And the benefit here is that because the data stay locally, you don't need these data use agreements, and you can scale them really rapidly. The disadvantage, though, of course, is that if you're analyzing in parallel, you really, really need to harmonize those data so that you're comparing apples and apples. And, we're not there yet in terms of, almost any field of science or medicine in harmonized data. And so along those lines, about a year and a half ago, we held a challenge competition. How can we build out a larger federated vision research network? And there were 4 of these winners of that. It was a $1 million challenge competition. Michael Boland, who's an ophthalmologist in Boston, Michelle Rybar, who's an informatician, ophthalmic informatician, who is in Oregon, George Hripsik, who's an informatician in New York City, and Gayatri Srinivas, who's a pediatric optometrist at Stanford. Okay, and so we were really excited about this. But as you think about an RFI, the one thing I'm interested in particular is there are relatively few open access vision-related real-world data platforms. Okay, most of these platforms that are out there, the ones that are vision-specific, are not publicly available. How can we expand this and create opportunities for the entire vision community to be able to take advantage of? Okay. So my last example, number 5 out of 5, is reproducibility. Okay, this has become a very big priority of Dr. Bhattacharya's, and for level setting, there are terms like replication and reproducibility that collectively taken refer to a spectrum of behaviors. So, for example, on one end of the spectrum, can you do the same experiment using the same methods and get the same result? Moving further along that spectrum, can different people test the same hypothesis using independent data and methods and then get consistent results? And then moving even further down that spectrum, things like triangulation or generalizability. And so on the left side, the question is, why is replication important and why do we care about it at the NIH? Well, because replication is foundational to establishing the credibility of scientific findings and really better understanding when do we have a higher confidence in findings that we should carry forward into more experimentation or, for example, clinical testing, clinical trials. And so on the right side of the slide, this really demonstrates that, there's more and more recognition that, we don't always do a good job in terms of, replicable science. The pie chart here comes from a study that was published in one of the Nature journals by a group from Bayer in pharma. And, they were trying to replicate studies, and the domain here was, cardiovascular research, oncology, and women's health. And what they showed is that for only 20% of the studies, they were able to successfully replicate what was originally published. And here the bias is that they would have presumably wanted to replicate those to develop drugs based on that. And so overall, okay, we really do have a lot of unanswered questions here. And how can we take the other going a little bit further with that, I would say that uh, if it's what reproducibility looks like is different depending on the type of research you're doing. In basic science, it's very well known that people often can't replicate a protocol that one person did. There's presumably something in that protocol, in the way you mix the reagents, that wasn't really articulated in the words that you need to be the senior postdoc to be able to know how to do. And my own academic background was largely in informatics, and in that field, it's well known that different groups can analyze the exact same data set and come up with nuanced interpretations, or sometimes opposite interpretations. And so, and the other aspect that I want to point out is that in terms of academic culture, we often favor positive results or innovative results, okay, rather than replication. So there's a lot of things that we have to tackle to really approach this field. And so here, in terms of an RFI, how can the vision field take more of a leadership role in reproducibility studies? And are there areas in vision science or clinical vision research that would benefit from reproducibility? Now, this is my last content slide, and that leads into meta science, data sharing, and team science. Meta science is one of those 4 NEI pillars in that diagram. And so, we see all the time that there are multiple parallel studies being done in the country that are basically trying to answer the same question, but are individually underpowered to really be able to answer those and to advance the field the way that all of us would want. And one obvious approach to that is, well, all these groups could simply share data with each other and we'd have bigger studies. And there's an NIH data sharing policy that went to effect 3 years ago that basically that's a stick in the world of carrots and sticks. You'll need to come up with a plan to share your data, otherwise we don't fund your research. In the 3 years since that data sharing policy went live, I've heard every single complaint about the NIH data sharing policy. And to me, that boils down to one of the root causes is that we define success academically based on individual metrics. How many papers have you published as senior author? What's your H index? How many grant dollars have you brought in as PI? And what I really don't want to see, and what I'm afraid we are seeing sometimes, is that people are sharing poor data as a check the box type exercise. And in that case, our whole community loses, and there's lost opportunities here. And so I more and more believe that we live in a world of 21st century team science, and what we all want is a whole that's greater than the sum of the parts. And I think to achieve that, we need to create incentives for researchers to want to participate in things like data sharing and team science, because I think that, in other words, carrots that go with that stick, are going to be ultimately what helps shift that culture. And along those lines, I'm really excited that we've been helping to lead this NIH data sharing challenge, okay, what we're calling an S-index challenge. And the goal of this is to develop a robust metric to reward people who share good data and that's useful to others. It's a $1 million prize competition, and yet we're leading it at the NEI. Amber Reed is one of our people who's really helping to shepherd that. But there are several other, there are about 15 other institutes at the NIH that are participating in this, including several other people who are helping Amber to lead this. But we announced 7 phase 1 winners about 6 months ago, and over the summer, okay, we're progressing into a phase 2 competition that's going to result in a grand prize. And so, for the RFI purposes, okay, if you have thoughts about opportunities for team science in the vision field, either in terms of infrastructure building or in terms of specific areas of research, please sort of share those with us. So my final slide is this: next steps. Okay, so we would love comments from any people, basically scientists, clinicians, and that means ophthalmologists, optometrists, clinicians from any other field of medicine, professional societies, patients, patient caregivers, patient advocates, the general public. And how do you do that? Go to this QR code. And it's also listed in the Federal Register. And the deadline is basically a month from now, April 15th, 2026. And here's an email address if you have questions. And the last thing that I want to say is that there is a broader NIH strategic planning process that's kicking off right now. stay tuned for that because there's going to be an NIH strategic plan RFI. Okay, we will post this on social media soon. And when more of the details become available, we'll send some email blast about this soon. But in addition to responding to this NEI RFI, please consider responding to that NIH-wide RFI. Okay, the people who review that are different from us, and so it's not going to be redundant. But as you think about responding to that NIH-wide RFI, okay, please sort of think about how vision research and vision health overall contribute to the overall NIH mission, and what are those opportunities for generalizable methodological innovation. Okay, so those are my prepared remarks. With that, I'm going to turn to thank you to those of you who submitted questions, and I know that Santa Tumina, and who's our NEI deputy director, and Richard Lee, who's our NEI clinical director, have compiled some of those, and we'll take those as well as some of those that have been coming in, and I'll just do my best to answer those in the time that we have available. Okay,
Thank
Santa,
you.
to you.
Yes. So just so that everybody is aware, Richard and I will be disembodied voices, so there is nothing wrong with your screens. If you don't see us, as long as you can hear us, that's great. I did want to mention again that we'll continue to take your questions. If you put them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, we might not get to them today, but we will try and answer as many as possible. And just want to let you know that we're going to post this webinar on a strategic plan webpage, which should go live by the end of this week, and we'll post running Q&A there as well as we start to get some additional questions, especially if we get very similar questions, because then we know that we should definitely be answering those things that we left maybe unclear, or something new pops into your head after the fact. Okay, so the questions run a gamut of themes. So the first one is, what is the role of animal model research in NEI priorities?
Santa, thank you for starting off with a easy and non-controversial one. Yeah, number one, animal research is not going away at the NIH and at the NEI. There have been, to say the obvious, incredible advances through animal research, and at NIH broadly, we are going to continue funding research involving animal models. That said, one of my aims is to be as transparent as I can with the community. Candidly, that strategy is undergoing a significant shift to prioritize NAMs and human-based research, and that is a joint priority, between the NIH and the FDA. Now, there has been, I've heard the concern within the community that NIH doesn't fund animal research anymore. That is not true. What is true is that every NIH funding opportunity that comes out that includes support for animal models is going to also include language to consider NAMs. Okay, so there's not going to be a NOFO that says, we want a pig model of AMD, for example. It's going to incorporate consideration of NAMs. The premise of this, I think, is obvious. Nobody wants to euthanize animals. The people who do animal research, nobody likes that part of it. And NAMs can help make animal researchers better and more efficient animal researchers. And there's an NIH-wide common fund project called Complementary that's led by NIEHS and NCATS that was based on this several years ago to catalyze that exact premise. And so, I guess in summary, we will continue to fund grants with animal research if they're scientifically appropriate and if they're justifiable, but there will be a higher bar for justification. And so as you write these, make sure to explain why a study can't be done using NAMs. And there were those from the 1950s, those 3 R's: replacement, reduction, and refinement. And you just keep things like that in mind. So I'll and just summarize by saying that NAMs are a priority, and that that's one of the reasons for the RFI. As you think about responding, sort of think about how we can have a leadership role in moving forward with that to really advance the field together. So I'm going to stop with that, but thank you.
Thank you, Mike. In addition to eliminating vision loss and enhancing quality of life, is prevention of vision loss also a strategic priority?
Prevention. Yeah, Richard, no, absolutely. Um, I think that there's been some really neat work that's happening and that's ongoing. If I could just spout off a couple examples of that. One of them is that within our own intramural research program, I mean, in collaboration with many others around the country, there's been clinical studies looking at things like causation and prevention of eye disease, and the ARID study and the ARID 2 studies, okay, that were led by Emily Chu, have been groundbreaking in terms of dietary supplements for how do you slow vision loss from AMD. And I just have to highlight one prevention study because it's top of mind, because there was just a kickoff meeting in Columbus, Ohio, that myopia. Okay, the prevalence has increased dramatically over the past several decades, and we recently funded a major clinical trial to look at the impact of low concentration atropine drops to delay myopic progression. But I guess the way that I think about this, Richard, is that we represent at the NEI, we represent the entire population. If you're healthy, if you have healthy vision, we want to keep you there, and that's the concept of prevention, sort of the premise of this question. If you have eye disease that's treatable, we want to develop better treatments, or develop treatments where they don't exist currently. And in the most extreme case, if you have untreatable disease where there's we look at vision rehabilitation strategies. So it's that whole spectrum. But yeah, prevention's a huge part of it for sure.
How can universities, faculty, and students participate in the conversation about gaps and opportunities, as well as contribute to the work to advance science?
Yeah, I think, Santa, the second part of that, contributing to the work, I think is pretty clear, right? The work is happening at the universities, and it's done by faculty and students. Let me focus on that first. I think it was like, is it how you participate in the conversation, right? Santa, that's like how they participate
Yes.
in. Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I would start right here with this RFI, and just to like double down and say that we want to hear from all stakeholders on this topic. And let me just highlight that we take these comments that we get from the community really seriously. Back in 2021, we got hundreds of comments when we were at the equivalent stage of what we're doing now. And, we read every single comment, and I personally read every single comment. We of course cannot promise that we're going to action every comment, which would be impossible because, we may receive hundreds of comments. But we can promise to think about every comment. And some of you know that there were a number of comments that we considered carefully to the point where we created NEI initiatives or even NIH-wide initiatives, based on those comments. And so, just as a reminder, the RFI goes until April 15th. If you or somebody else could put the link to the RFI into the chat just so people have it, I would love that. And I would just again highlight the fact that NIH is going through a similar strategic planning process, and they're going to have an RFI. Because NIH is our parent organization, it's going to be important to make sure that we're working in sync with them, more important than ever before, and how to establish that work in the vision community can play a major role in contributing to the overall NIH mission. So I hope that you'll consider responding to that NIH-wide RFI as well. So with that, I'm gonna stop with that, and thank you to whoever asked that question.
Okay, Mike, this next question is very much in your swim lane. What are the expectations for artificial intelligence to genuinely improve clinical outcomes in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yes. It's funny that earlier this morning, a few of the program officers and I had a meeting with some folks that interact with CMS on some topics related to exactly this sort of clinical outcomes and getting things into the real world. Richard, let me you're right. I'll try to spend a couple minutes talking about this because everybody is talking about AI, and it's all over the NIH strategic plan and the HHS wide strategic plans, and to say the obvious, there have been major advances in AI. I mean, 10 years ago, we were talking about programs that beat the world chess experts or Jeopardy experts, and now we're talking about beating doctors on board exams. And some of you know that the team at DeepMind, Google, developed a system that could win like the International Math Olympiad contest. And these are questions that require extensive reasoning that only 20 people in the country can do at that level. And so. And just also to say the obvious, I think that there are huge opportunities for us to continue to take more of a leadership role in these areas. Clinical diagnosis, foundational models, basic science, and let me just give a couple examples of what I see as, because I think that Richard, your question had to do with future, and I think you said next 5 to 10 years. One challenge that I see is that doctors don't just look at OCT images to diagnose, well, is there dry AMD? There are a lot of things that go into assessing a patient. When you look at that image, you look at a lot of things. You also have to integrate history, other tests, other images, and you need to do that at the point of real world care, which means integrating into an EHR system. And so there are a lot of things in that pipeline that I think we have to get together if we're really going to get these into real world care. Some of you know that we're trying to develop some programs on this already. Another challenge that I see is that clinical outcomes are not just for the eye clinic. We're seeing now the opportunity to bring eye care into newer locations. That newer location could be a primary care doctor's office, and it could be a drugstore or a patient's home. And the purposes could be for a lot of different things. Disease screening, early detection, or it could be monitoring, home monitoring of disease, for example. And the disease in question could be a eye disease, or it could be a systemic medical disease, in an oculomics type, perspective. And so I think that there's a lot of new opportunities along those lines. And there's also a lot of opportunities for collaboration with engineers who might need to build new devices to do those things. I think another challenge, which was the topic of the meeting that we were just in, so it's fresh in my mind, is that we may need to develop and validate new economic models of healthcare and show how AI can be clinically effective as well as cost effective. And there may be opportunities here for collaboration with health economists or payers in terms of designing these studies. I think that we're going to have to, as another real world challenge, the people who use these are going to be clinicians, and we're going to have to work with that community to figure out what should the practice of medicine look like in the future, and what should the teaching of medicine look like in the future. And we've had some really interesting conversations with the AAMC leadership, medical school deans and the sort. and what role can we play in the vision field to because our practice has evolved so fast compared to other fields. We blend image data and clinical data. And the last thing that I would say, if I may, and I'm sorry to go on for so long with this, Richard, is that I think that there are major opportunities in laboratory research in the process of scientific research. There's been some amazing work in terms of AI agents, to make researchers more effective and more efficient researchers. And how do we develop and validate those, those pipelines? I know that goes beyond the scope of, what you talked. I know your question was focused on clinical care, but I couldn't resist leaving that out. So I'm going to stop with that. But I think there's a ton of potential here for the community.
So, Mike, this next question you touched on in your slides, but I think it bears amplification and repeating, and clearly there's concern within the community. So, with the elimination of the traditional funding pay line, could you explain how funding decisions are now determined?
Yeah, of course. Santa, no, happy to speak. I know this is an issue that everybody's asking about, and so let me, Santa, you're right that we did talk about that. And in fact, I'm going to pull up my own slide here just in a second, if that's okay. But let me just amplify, some of this. So you're right. Traditionally, NEI has not had a strict pay line, and the way that we've always done it is that we've prioritized applications based on peer review and program recommendations and alignment with our NEI strategic plan. And as you know, we try to fund as many what we call meritorious projects as possible. And the process of that fundamentally is not going to change. We have to get concurrence from our NEI council, and we have to have enough funding available. And so moving forward, we are going to continue to do all of those things. And I would say that the biggest difference is that alignment with the NEI and NIH strategic plans is going to be considered more strongly. And so just if I could give advice to the people who are on this, just make sure you're familiar with the NEI strategic plan. And the other corollary to that is make sure to reach out to your program officers, before you submit an application. Ideally, when you're in the planning stages, I think it's going to be ideal to have a draft specific aims page, but you don't want to do it too early. And I think it's not always that helpful to call the program officer a week before the deadline. And so the point that I want to make with this is that we have a great group of program officers. I mean, they're nice people. They truly want to help. And we have the philosophy here that you all are the ones that do most of the work. And when you succeed, we succeed. And so we're in this together. So that's how I think I'll stop with that, Santa.
Thank you, Mike. This next question you also touched on in your presentation to some extent, but we've been asked if you could please dig into the topic of cell and gene therapy for retinal degeneration a bit more. This is probably the last question with the time we have.
Okay. Yeah, I think clearly that's something that we care about, and I care about. And one of the things I did try to highlight is that there's been some really amazing innovation in both cell therapy and gene therapy within the vision field, both extramurally and within our own intramural research program. And now there's more and more emphasis on NAMs, and so some of these, especially cell-based models, just please sort of think about that in your RFIs. If I can just highlight, maybe I'll use this as an opportunity to highlight this bespoke gene therapy consortium. The premise of that, this gene therapy AAV models is it was a collaborative project. There were 10 institutes at the NIH, industry, FDA, and the premise of that is how can we discover knowledge that's useful in a pre-competitive space? And in this case, that resulted in a playbook. And the idea is that this bespoke gene therapy was for ultra rare diseases, and the playbook was meant to be a template that could help these small companies studying ultra rare diseases get things through regulatory approval more easily and in a more standardized manner. And so, that has sort of informed some of our thinking about how we might do things in the future. Cell-based therapies. At the NIH, we at the NEI have been leading a cell-based therapy working group together with NIAMS, the National Institute of Arthritis and Musculoskeletal Diseases. And our lead for that is Santa Tuminia, and she's working, and Santa's leading with her counterpart in NIAMS. And so their question is, can we build collaborative NIH-wide projects in cell-based therapies, and what are the gaps in knowledge similar to those gaps for gene therapy, for example, that could benefit in a pre-competitive space? And so if you all have thoughts for an RFI on what's missing for cell therapy or for NAMs in general, like what's it going to take to get these to the stage where they're ready for regulatory approval, I think there's going to be a lot of work that needs to be done. In Santa's and NIAMS' survey, there were a lot of questions raised. For example, cell manufacturing, QA, QC, standardization. Could there be AI used to improve that process? Delivery methods, and so those are some of the things that I think I would suggest. So number one, I wanted to let you know that that's what's on my mind. But number two, I want to just emphasize how the rest of you can help us at the NEI. If I could say one last thing, Richard, is that broadly speaking, one of the things that we at the NEI are interested in is how can we better help support a translational research pipeline. And that may involve, for example, supporting more early phase clinical trials that could help us work better with industry, maybe to help de-risk those projects, for industry. What can they better take as a handoff to them? And if you have thoughts about that, because I think that relates in some ways to this conversation about gene therapy and cell therapy and NAMs, please consider writing about those in an RFI. And I just want to use this to plug an Arvo workshop that, Richard, I know you have been working on together with Kapil Bharti and Sangeeta Bhargav, which is the topic of that workshop is sort of how can NEI better collaborate with industry? And Richard, is there anything else that you would want to say about that Arvo workshop?
Well, thank you very much for the plug, and also for Kapil and Sangeeta's leadership of that. No, I think you've highlighted that. I know we're at time, Mike. So is there anything you want to do to wrap up?
No, I'm just going to say that to all of you, at one point I peeked at the participant things, and we were up to close to like 400 participants. And I thank you for to all of you for showing out here today. And what I'm going to just say is that we really mean it when we say that a strategic plan belongs to the entire community, because this mission statement, eliminating vision loss and improving quality of life through vision research, is what all of us want. And along those lines, you can help us by submitting ideas to an RFI. And when the NIH-wide RFI comes out, you can also help our community by giving thoughts to that. And so with that, I'll say that I'm looking forward to staying in touch with all of you as we go through this process. And thank you again for coming. We'll end with that.